July 28, 1866, 39th Congress. Be it enacted by the Senate and House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that the military peace establishment of the United States shall hereafter consist 5 regiments of artillery, 10 regiments of cavalry, 45 regiments of infantry, and the professors and corps of cadets of the United States Military Academy, and such other forces as shall be provided for by this act, to be known as the Army of the United States of America. And be it further enacted that to the 6 regiments of cavalry now in service there shall be added 4 regiments, 2 of which shall be composed of colored men, having the same organization as now provided by law for cavalry regiments.
The work that the Buffalo Soldiers did on behalf of this country helped establish who we are today. In many ways, they helped open up the West. Lewis and Clark in the early 1800s blazed the first trail through to the Pacific Ocean. And once that happened, of course, President Jefferson saw that we have to expand our country and we needed to grow. And we needed the challenge of that because that's what Americans live off of, is the challenge. Therefore, it became imperative that we spread west as quickly and as efficient as possible. Part of that challenge was put in the hands of black soldiers because we found through the Civil War that black soldiers were in fact very courageous, very brave, and technically competent beyond anyone's imagination at the time. And once they were given the task to come west, to help settle the West, of course they did it in an exemplary manner.
Well, I come now to the War of the Rebellion. My master was a general in the rebel army, and he took me along as his body servant through the war. I was with him in 29 battles. Well, by being with the Stonewall Jackson Cavalry, I engeared a great liking for the cavalry soldiers. And on July 16, 1867, I went to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and Colonel L.H. Carpenter was raising the 10th U.S. Cavalry. And I enlisted on the 16th day of July, 1867, for the Indian Wars that was then raging in Kansas and Colorado. Reuben Waller, 10th U.S. Cavalry, 1867.
They, in fact, in many ways, were the Pony Express. And that's a little known fact. But Buffalo Soldiers helped the Pony Express deliver mail westward. When the Pony Express no longer was, many Buffalo Soldiers took up that role in delivering mail. So when you talk about the delivery of U.S. mail west, many times we think of the Pony Express, but we never think of the Buffalo Soldiers. Well, in fact, they were just as important to that adventure as anyone else.
In 1873, I was sent with a detail of 12 men of my company to carry the mail to Fort Bliss. Each man carried a mail sack strapped to the cantle of his saddle, and we were armed with 7 shooting Springfield rifles. At Eagle Springs, we were attacked by about 100 Apaches. The fight lasted several hours, during which the Indians made repeated charges. We were on an open plain without any protection whatever. Be we dismounted, held our horses by the halter reins, kept close together, and withheld our fire until the Indians charged up within close range. Our rapid fire from long-range guns wrought such havoc that in the evening they drew off after killing one of our men. Sergeant Jake Wilkes, 9th Cavalry, former slaves, served in the 116th U.S. Colorado Infantry of the war between the states.
No real enlightenment of history has been done for the Buffalo Soldiers, 9th and 10th Cavalry, the 24th and 25th Infantries. What they did in San Juan Hill, Kettle Hill, you know, how bravely they fought. They were never given credit for how bravely they fought.
I'm Theodore Roosevelt, and I'm glad to see you. This terrain here reminds me of my time in Cuba. I was assigned down there during the Spanish War to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, and we were assigned to take the high ground outside of Santiago. On my right were my boys from the Rough Riders, and on my left was the 10th United States Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers. And we were assigned to move across the valley and take the high ground of Kettle Hill. The terrain behind me reminds me exactly of that spot. As we moved forward, my men fought brilliantly, and the 10th Cavalry Unit fought like they meant it. We charged up that hill and we fought Spanish at every turn. And when we reached the high ground, we had received 25% casualties on both my right and left flank. But when we reached the high ground, we were victorious, and we knew that we had done something great. And I looked around, and the 10th Cavalry was proud of what they had done. The orders came down, and we were assigned to take the other high ground, San Juan Heights, across a small valley. I mustered the troops, and I mustered the 10th, and a few stragglers from the 9th came over. And we led a charge across the valley and up the hill and took the second high ground, again taking 25% casualties in the Buffalo Soldiers. As we reached the high ground on San Juan Hill above Santiago, we knew that we had won the day, and we raised the stars and stripes, and we all gave a shout of hurrah when we did it. The 9th and 10th Cavalry in that one battle had proved their tenure as fighting men and protectors of the United States. When I became president and the Antiquities Act came into law in 1906, I looked around for no finer troops than the 9th and 10th U.S. Cavalry to be assigned to those newly acquired territories, the monuments, the national monuments and the national parks that were being assigned. They had outstanding qualities to go and protect those areas and become the first park rangers. Although they were not called that at the time, they were called park protectors. But I could find no finer unit than the 9th and 10th U.S. Cavalry to take on those roles. And it is my pleasure to salute them today. With the terrain surrounding you, the natural environment we have, the 9th and 10th played an enticing role in doing what we have done in 1898 and again in 1906. A proud history of the Buffalo Soldiers is one that you should realize and read about.
People need to understand the whole history of their country, not part of it. And they're missing a big part of it, that everyone had a part in settling and helping the territories become states, because most of the West weren't all territories. They were not states. There was no such thing as the state of Wyoming. Wyoming was part of the Dakota territories. People don't understand the state lines and how they helped. Here in Colorado, many different battles here helped settle Colorado, like Beecher's Island, where there was a battle right there on the Kansas and Nebraska line.
Well, we plunged right into the fights. Beaver Creek, Cheyenne Wells, and many others. One great sensation was the rescue at Beecher Island on Arickaree Creek in Colorado, September 1868. The Indians had surrounded General Forsyth and 50 brave men, and had killed or wounded 20 men, and had compelled the rest to live on dead horses' flesh for 9 days on a small island. Colonel L.H. Carpenter, with his Company H 10th U.S. Cavalry, was that word of the fix that Beecher was in, and we entered the race for the island. And in 26 hours, Colonel Carpenter and myself and his hostler rode into the rifle pits. And what a sight we saw. 30 wounded and dead men, right in the middle of 50 dead horses. They had lain in the hot sun for 10 days. And these men had eaten the dead flesh of those horses for 8 days. The men were in dying condition when Carpenter and myself dismounted and began to rescue them. Reuben Waller, 10th U.S. Cavalry, 1867.
The name came from the first battle. They were created in 1866, but the first real battle they had was in June of 1867, where they got that name because of their ferociousness in fighting, the tenacity of their fighting. And between the tenacity of their fighting and their hair, it reminded the Indians of the buffalo because of that tenacity, their fierceness they had, their courage they showed in tackling whatever came before them. No fear at all.
They did things like lay hundreds of miles of telegraph lines. They built and protected cities. They performed functions like the sheriff. They fought Indians, they supported Indians. So they did a whole lot of functions. And after they were formed into official brigades and regiments, but they were still isolated, all black troops. But they were tasked by the President and Congress to perform every function imaginable, primarily to the West.
Those who write the history are the ones that control the history. So they didn't write much history about them, and very little was said about them and all the activities. Like there was 23 Medal of Honor winners from 1867 to 1907 serving in the military, from out here in the West during the hostile Indian periods to Cuba and the Philippines.
I left camp on the 20th of May, taking the Kickapoo Road. When some 14 miles out, I discovered a party of Indians making across the hills, having a herd of horses with them. I charged, and after a slight scrimmaging, they abandoned the herd and took to the mountains. Having secured the horses, 9 in number, I resumed my march in Kickapoo Spring and camped for the night. The following morning, I decided to return to the post with my captured stock, as they were embarrassed for their operations, as my command was small, numbering 10 all told. I accordingly started about 6 o'clock a.m. When about 2 miles from Kickapoo, I discovered a part of Indians about 20 in number, making for a couple of government teams, which were about 3 miles in advance of me. They evidently meant to capture the stock, as there was only a small guard with the teams. I immediately attacked them by charging them. They tried hard to make a stand to get their herds of horses off, but I set the Spencers whistling about their ears so lively they broke in confusion and fled to the hills, leaving us their herds of 5 horses. Resuming towards camp, the skirmish along my left flank to the 8th mile waterhole. Evidently being determined to take the stock, I turned my little command loose on them, and after a few volleys they left me to continue my march in peace. I reached camp at 2 p.m. of the 21st with 15 heads of horses captured from the Indians. The casualty of this scout was 1 horse slightly wounded. I have the honor to be, very respectfully, your obedient servant, Emmanuel Stantz, Sergeant, Company F, 9th Cavalry.
June 1st, 1870. The gallantry displayed by Sergeant Emmanuel Stantz and his party, as well as good judgment used on both occasions, deserves much praise. As this is the 4th or 5th encounter that Sergeant Stantz has had with Indians within the past 2 years, in all of which occasions he has been mentioned for good behavior, by his immediate commanding officer. It is a pleasure to commend him to higher authority. Henry Carroll, Captain, 9th Cavalry, Commanding Post.
We are called the Buffalo Soldiers and Troopers Motorcycle Club because troopers was the name for the cavalry part of the regiment and the soldiers were the infantry part. We ride motorcycles, so we have iron horses. We use gas instead of grass, and so we travel around. We share the knowledge of the Buffalo Soldiers, which is kind of good because we were Buffalo Soldiers on our back, which people always ask, what does that mean and who are they? To me, the reason is history. I mean, it's something that we don't want to forget. I know that when I used to watch Westerns, you never saw the black folks escorting wagon trains or riding the Pony Express when in fact they were part of that history. So I think that's a big key for continuing the history. The legacy. Where did we come from? The forts. All of the West was built with the support of the Buffalo Soldiers. Without them, we never would have moved west because that was some of the dirty job and the other soldiers didn't want to do it. There was discrimination. They got the hand-me-downs, they got the worst equipment. However, they were smart enough to go barter and trade with the Native Americans to get better equipment so that they could do their job.
May 22nd, 1870. Sir, the 10th is getting mean and worn-out horses of the 7th Cavalry. Some have died upon reaching the post. Since our first mount in 1867, this regiment has received nothing but broken-down horses and repaired equipment, as I am willing to testify to, as far as my knowledge goes. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, L.H. Carpenter, Captain, 10th Cavalry.
They were expected to come out and do some of the harshest tasks that were not given to white regiments and white troops. They were expected to last longer, fight harder, and engage the enemy.
April 23, 1870. They had marched about 1,000 miles, over 200 of which was through country never explored by troops. Drove the Indians from every rancheria. They captured 40 horses and mules. I cannot speak too highly of the conduct of the officers and men under my command, always cheerful and ready, braving the severest hardships with short rations and no water, without a murmur. The Negro troops know no fear and are capable of great endurance. Albert Morrow, Major, H Company, 10th Cavalry.
It's important that all of our children and all of our citizens know that the West was not only won with white regiments, that there is an element of black soldiers that helped settle what we now call Colorado.
The Buffalo Soldiers, back in 1866 when they were formed, accounted for, at that time, the four regiments we're concerned with, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiments. The Cavalry Regiment were 20% of the cavalry. The infantry were 8% of the infantry regiments. Total of 11.4% of all the military soldiers out here. There were fewer than 25,000 soldiers guarding, protecting the West from outlaws, hostile Indians, bad guys laying roads, laying telegraph wires and everything else. So they were all over. But in Colorado particularly, there were a lot of action to help Colorado become a state. They guarded the surveyors as they drew the state lines to make Colorado a state. They laid roads, telegraph lines. They protected against mobs, outlaws. So they did a lot here in Colorado. This is why Colorado is so important to understand the history of the Buffalo Soldiers, which is, in that case, when you talk about Buffalo Soldiers, you're talking about both cavalry and infantry.
Let's be honest about race in the country. Okay, it's always been a stigma that white soldiers were the glory, white soldiers did all the charging, white soldiers did all the fighting. And there was no one to write the history of the Buffalo Soldier. There was not black writers there. And I believe that the only reason that the Buffalo Soldier was recognized in this country history because the Indians thought them to be fierce battlers, that they fought to the end. I think without that, they would just been recognized as regular cav soldiers, did the fighting of different race, and their history would never be told. But the Indians, the Native Americans of this nation, I believe is the reason why the Buffalo Soldier is recognized in this nation.
Colorado Springs is filled with wonderful Western history. It's part of what makes our city a major travel destination. One of the more exciting segments of our past is the story of the African American soldiers who wanted to stay in the United States Army after the Civil War ended. The Plains Indians dubbed them Buffalo Soldiers for the honor they held for them. These brave 9th and 10th Cavalry regiments. Their service in protecting the pioneers, subduing any Indians that threatened the safety of settlers in the West, is as profound as it is unrecognized. This chapter in our Western culture is a tale of pride, dignity, and glory that is not talked about enough. But we can make a change. Please join me in helping Colorado Springs remember the legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers.
Fighting on arrival, fighting for survival. I mean it. When I analyze the stench, to me it makes a lot of sense. How the dreadlock Rasta was a buffalo soldier, and he was taken from Africa, brought to America, fighting on a